and welcome to Kingston Now. I'm Jimmy Buff. This week we're at the Trolley Museum of New York for a little trip into the past. Today we're going to talk about trolleys, trains, and even steamboats. And joining me right now is the president of the Trolley Museum, Jon McGrew. Hi, Jon.
Hello.
Tell me about the museum. When did it get started?
The organization was founded in 1955, but back in those days it was in Brooklyn, New York. The people who started the organization had a goal to save the trolleys that would otherwise just have been scrapped. It's a real piece of history they wanted to preserve. These are the ways cities expanded, actually, was by having transit lines that could take people out into other areas. So the history affects more than simply people who like to ride streetcars or rode them to work. It really was a whole way of life for America. So the group of enthusiasts started collecting the cars. They had no place to run them. They didn't know what they might end up doing with them, but they just knew the first step is to save them. They were scattered around a variety of places in the city, and finally, many years later, 1983, Kingston had trackage available and wanted to start some sort of operation, but nothing to run on it. And they heard of the group in Brooklyn, and the two groups got together, and here we are.
So what happens here at the museum? What is your mission now?
Well, part of it is the same as it's always been, that is to preserve the cars. But now we're moving into the next stage also of trying to restore some of the cars and get them operating. We have one car from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, built in 1925, that we use as our regular operation here. And on weekends and holidays during the summer, that runs out from the museum to the foot of Broadway and also in the other direction to Kingston Point, and provides, I think, a real nice ride for people here.
Now, is that the train that came to you damaged in a collision that you restored?
Yes. When Johnstown ended their service in 1960, a lot of the museums scrambled for their cars because they were so nicely kept. Our museum didn't, because at the time we had no place to operate anything. That car that we have now had gone originally to Stone Mountain, Georgia, which was primarily a railroad operation. And they wanted to have a streetcar there, but they didn't have any way of running it as a streetcar would. That is, normally we'd have an overhead wire and a pole collecting the current from the wire to run the car, and the streetcars are typically all electric. They needed a car that could be self-propelled, so they converted that car to run with a diesel engine. And that's actually what we needed here. We had another gasoline-powered car we were using. We wanted to get a second car, so we acquired that from Georgia. And once we got into the discussions, we found that the reason they were willing to let it go was it had been damaged and one end was missing on the car. And volunteers here rebuilt the car, and it's looking pretty good now, in operation every weekend during the summer.
So what happens here at the museum besides the trolley rides, which happen every weekend in the summer?
Well, of course, we're chartered as a nonprofit educational organization too, so we always want to have a focus on education here and try to think about what is it we're showing people. We have a visitor center upstairs. We run videos on the history of trolleys, and we have displays that show both the history of the development of the streetcar itself and trolleys in Kingston and how they fit into the neighborhoods and fit into the scheme of things here. Also, we operate out to Kingston Point, and Kingston Point Park was a big focus of the city. When railway companies were in their heyday, a lot of the railway companies used to build amusement parks at the end of the line. And the reason for that was at the beginning of the 1900s, that was pretty much the first time people had seen any electric operation. A lot of people didn't have electricity in their homes yet, but they could come to this amusement park and see lights everywhere. And the reason they lit them up so much was it was a brand new phenomenon for people. People hadn't seen that. And they would put them at the end of the line because, number one, people would have to pay full fare to get there. And number two, that's where land was cheap. And the third one was it would give them ridership off the busy times, off hours. So they'd have riders on weekends and riders at night, rather than just rush hour commuters on the line. So it worked out real well. A lot of cities had amusement parks.
And there was one at Kingston Point.
Kingston Point used to have carousel and a lot of different amusements out there. That's long gone now. There's hardly any trace of it anymore. But one building that is still there was the end of the streetcar line that came out to it. We're actually operating on what used to be a railroad line here. This is a part of the Ulster Delaware Railroad that we're using. But the streetcar line used to come in from the other side, used to come down from the Delaware Avenue entrance into the park. And there's a shelter as you come into the park that was the original trolley stop. And that's still there from those days.
When did trolleys stop running in Kingston?
Kingston stopped using streetcars in 1926.
That's early.
A lot of the railway companies were having real problems back then because that was during the time that automobiles had become very popular. And although Americans had a love affair with trolleys at the beginning of the 1900s, by 1920s, a lot of people had automobiles, and railway companies were having some real difficulties in making ends meet. And Kingston just didn't keep up with the fight, I guess, and lost their trolley lines. Actually, though, before that, it had been very successful here. We actually had 2 competing trolley companies running different operations here.
We're coming to the end of the season for the outdoor trolley rides, but you do have a couple more coming early in December for the holidays.
We do. We have just one more scheduled run. We have the Santa run on December 3rd. Other than that, we are actually finished with the season now, but we'll begin the new season at the end of May of 2012.
Tell me about the Santa Claus ride.
Of course, we try to do everything we can for the kids here and have them have a chance to see Santa. And
is it you?
Take a ride. No, it's Santa.
Okay.
It's not me. The rides are $2 for adults or children. Because it's a special event, we give a special fare for it. And it's a good time for all, I think.
Tell people how they can find out more about the Trolley Museum of New York.
The best way is to see our website. The website is tmny.org. That's Trolley Museum of New York, tmny.org. And there's a lot of information out there about the history of the museum and pictures of the cars that we have. And we have quite a collection of cars in the building, but you can get a glimpse of that on the website.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
This is Kingston Now. When we come back, we're going to talk to the authors of a new book about the railroads in Ulster County. Stay with us. Welcome back to Kingston Now. This week we're on location at the Trolley Museum of New York, and joining us now are the authors of a new book about Ulster County Railroads, Steve Ladin and Glendon Moffett. Hi guys.
Howdy.
You have titled your book Ulster County Railroads.
Yes, we have.
It's a great name. It's descriptive. It's what the book is about. Let's talk some railroads in Ulster County. Glenn, we'll start with you. When did railroads come into Ulster County?
Probably in around the 1850s.
And were they passenger? Were they here for passengers first, or were they for commerce?
They were for commerce mainly.
And in the book, you guys talk about at one point the heyday of Ulster County Railroads. There were 5 operating train lines in the county. Steve, what were they?
Well, you have the Central New England Railway, which is now it's the walkway over the Hudson, so it went across the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge. That was the one railroad that didn't go through Kingston. Then we have the West Shore Railroad. We have the Ontario and Western Railroad. We have the Wallkill Valley Railroad. And then we have the Ulster and Delaware Railroad. So those 4 railroads all went through Kingston.
So Kingston was the hub for that. How did that work? I mean, what was that scene like?
Well, it was there were a busy railroad. We're right now in a rail yard on the roundout and we have a picture of it in the book. And if you look at that picture, you see all kinds of commerce and industry, piles of coal, everything you can imagine here. And then there was another major rail yard, which was uptown in Kingston, or more like Midtown, Cornell Street.
Yeah.
So Kingston and
was
it stretches
out to like where the Red Barn used to be, where Montgomery Ward's was, is the end of it.
Yeah, and you still see remnants of sidings. The CSX Corporation, which owns the West Shore tracks, and there's a lot of freight trains that go up and down on the West Shore. And they do have a rail yard of sorts here in Kingston. And also some of the rail yard is also occupied by the scenic railroad, Catskill Mountain Railroad.
Which still does those limited runs out of Kingston Plaza.
Yes, yes.
The heyday of railroads here, Glenn, when was that?
About 1930 it was.
And then what happened? What precipitated the decline of railroads in Ulster?
Cars.
Simply cars.
Well, cars and
the economy changed. They used to be agriculturally oriented, and the market for milk and stuff disappeared, and passenger service disappeared because people weren't going on to the hotels up here in the Catskills.
Well, part of it also was in the 60s and 50s, Eisenhower was responsible for this whole interstate highway system. And so when you had all these major population centers easily accessible via these superhighways, the trucking industry really grew. And so the use of at least the freight lines of the railroads declined quite a bit. And then, of course, personal transportation became easier. So people really wanted to be able to go when and where, whenever they wanted. You know, they didn't want to have to wait for any kind of schedule. So that was another reason for at least the decline of passenger service. And I think those of us that are old enough remember that in the 50s we kind of all had these train sets, and you know, there was a lot of trains, passenger trains and freight trains still running. By the 60s they were quickly disappearing.
There's a romance associated to trains and to loving trains. Why do you think that? I mean, even my son, who's 3, is in love with trains. What is the fascination with trains?
I really don't know. But all the kids love them. Back in the days of steam, and even with the diesels, the steam engines are more personal than the diesel engines are. Every steam engine has its own little idiosyncrasies, and the people that operated them would always want to work the same engine after they got used to it.
Yeah, I think another thing about it is is that when you look at these machines, they were just really beautiful machines. I mean, the phrase "form follows function" really applies to trains of all sorts, not only the diesel engines and steam engines, but the passenger cars. And then, of course, in the 30s, when modern design really became very popularized, you know, you had a lot of these trains that were streamlined designs, and those almost came out of the Art Deco movement. And today you see people are really attached to those kinds of developments in design.
Did you guys, were you surprised by anything while you were researching this book? Did you get startled by anything or come across anything that you didn't expect to find?
Well, I don't know if we were surprised. It was very gratifying, you know, to go and learn all of these new things. I mean, you could look at a picture and you kind of deduce what was going on throughout all strata of society, not only the railroads, but you could look at a railroad and you kind of look at what the freight is there, and you can say, gee, that's interesting, that was going on at that time. So it was interesting from that point of view to kind of try to deduce what else was going on throughout, you know, politically, industrially, recreationally, that sort of thing. And also the other thing, we got a chance to look at some architecture and really take a close look at it, because when you're doing a book, obviously, you start looking at things more differently and more carefully.
So the vestiges of those 5 railroad companies that were operating during the heyday are the tracks that lay across Ulster County. How much of that has been put to use, other use?
Well, there's the Wallkill Valley Railroad, which became the Wallkill Valley Rail Trail, and that rail trail goes from south of Gardner all the way up close to now. It will eventually be coming into Kingston, and it's a wonderful rail trail. Anybody who's ever visited New Paltz, there are thousands of people. On a weekend day like today, it'll be mobbed with people going up and down, and the same is true with the Ontario and Western, the Hurley Rail Trail. So and Walkway over the Hudson. I mean, something like 1 million people went over Walkway over the Hudson, exceeding their estimates for use of that particular feature.
Which is such a great story. An old railroad bridge that had burned and was just sitting there rusting, doing nothing, and they converted it to that use. And as you said, it's just exceeded everyone's expectations.
It's an amazing place. Every time I'm passing by, I have to stop and just take a walk out on that bridge. It's just beautiful, stunning.
Steve Ladin, Glenn Moffett, the authors of Ulster County Railroads, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you for
This is Kingston Now. Next up is William Ewen Jr., the author of Steamboats on the Hudson. Stay with us. Welcome back to Kingston Now. Steamboats are most often associated with scenes on the Mississippi River, but they actually got their start on the mighty Hudson River. And here to talk about that is the author of a new book, Steamboats on the Hudson, William Ewen Jr. Hi, Bill.
How are you?
So tell me, why do people associate steamboats with the Mississippi and not the Hudson?
Most likely because of Mark Twain. When you say American steamboat, that's what they think of.
Little good publicity, huh?
Oh, sure, sure. But, I mean, there were steamboats, there were experiments that worked in places like Rhode Island, England, and so forth, even before Fulton. But his steamboat was the first commercially successful steamboat, and that's the key. He was able to keep it running. He had the money to do it, and a partner that helped.
Now, his trials and tests were down in New York Harbor in that area, is that correct?
No, his first steamboat, which was not called the Claremont, was the North River Steamboat, was the real name, ran from New York to Albany. The first night, on the first trip, they spent the night off of Claremont, which was his partner, Robert Livingston's estate. And the name Claremont became associated with the ship. But no, she was built to run between New York and Albany without relying on wind.
Tell me about the steamboats that traveled on the Hudson River. What kind of boats were they?
Well, there were actually a lot of different kinds. There were so many different services. You had ferry boats. The river was a north and south highway, but getting across east and west, there was a barrier. So there were ferry boats. There was the movement of freight by freight boats. The big night boats also had freight decks. They carried a lot of freight and automobiles. And then the tugs, one of the biggest tugboat companies on the river was based here in Rondout, Cornell Steamboat Company, and they moved thousands of tons of coal. And then there were the steamboats that were New York to Albany, like the Hudson River Day Line. They were the day boats. They were night boats, day boats. And probably the last stronghold of steamboats on the river were the excursion boats. You know, by the end of the 30s, you know, traveling by night was just not, they couldn't compete with automobiles and trains and so forth. But the steamboats, excursion boats, people still wanted day excursions out of New York City, get away from the heat of the city. But there were quite a number of different types of services on the river.
When the steamboats began running on the Hudson, how did that impact commerce and things like that? Did it have a huge impact?
Yeah, I would say it did. More so. In the early years, Fulton and Livingston had a monopoly granted by the New York State Legislature, and only they could operate steamboats on the waters of New York State. But that was struck down eventually by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. And after that, the river was open to all comers. You know, anybody who could design or build a steamboat could run one. And the design developments were very rapid after that. And to answer your question, yes, the commerce and the economies were affected because all these little towns and the major cities were connected in a much more reliable and more rapid means of transportation than they were before.
What was the scene in Kingston for steamboats? What steamboats made this a regular port of call? Was it mostly passengers?
A combination. Kingston was, or Rondout was probably the largest port between New York and Albany. Again, mostly because of the D&H Canal, all that thousands of tons of coal coming down and were transferred to from the small canal boats to large barges, and then the tugboat carried them, you know, took them to New York. They moved a lot of bluestone, ice, and other things. And but there were passenger steamboats from here. The Mary Powell, of course, was probably the most famous of all Hudson River steamboats, and this was her home port. She'd leave here in the morning and go to New York and come back in the evening. And the day line would stop at Kingston Point out at on the river there. That was one of their regular stops on the way to Albany or New York. It was a lot of activity here. Small steamboats. There were little steamboats that were almost like the buses of their day. They would connect Kingston with other small towns along the river, towns that were maybe too small for the big boats to land. And so yeah, it was a very important harbor.
We're at the Trolley Museum of New York today, and you're here to give a talk about steamboats on the Hudson River. They have a lot of restored trolley cars and train cars here. Are there restored steamboats running up and down the Hudson River?
No. Unfortunately, it's I'm not sure what the mindset is in this country. In Europe, there are. I mean, they've restored a number of side-wheel steamboats, over 100 years old.
And on the Mississippi, right?
A few. One just came back into service that had been laid up for about 3 years. And they're new. They're not restorations. But for the most part, sail is considered historic in this country. Steamboats, not so much. There is an effort, excuse me, a group that owns a steamer, Columbia, from the Detroit River. She was built in 1902, some of the same designers that designed the Hudson River Dayline steamers. And she hasn't operated for a number of years, but it's a nonprofit foundation, and they'd love to restore it, bring it to New York, and operate it on the Hudson. So yeah, that right now, as far as I can see, that's the only hope of a real steamboat on the Hudson.
And your interest, are you ever interested in spearheading an effort to bring one back to the Hudson? Would you like to sail on one?
Oh, yeah, I sure would. I grew up doing that. I'd love to hear a chime, steam whistle like going off the hills in the Highlands and so forth.
That's it for Kingston Now this week. We want to thank the Trolley Museum of New York and President Jon McGrew. We want to thank authors Steve Ladin and Glendon Moffett, authors of the book Ulster County Railroads, and William Ewen Jr., author of Steamboats on the Hudson, both available from Arcadia Publishing, available at arcadiapublishing.com. For information about the Trolley Museum, go to tmny.org. I'm Jimmy Buff. We'll see you next time.